Welcome everyone to our third and final webinar series for the summer of 2021. My name is Dr. Benjamin Park. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies here. And we are very grateful for all of you who can attend this live on Zoom, as well as those of you who are watching this later. Before I introduce our distinguished guest for the night, I am going to turn the digital mic over to Dr. Matthew Jordan, the chair of the department.
Thank you, Dr. Park. It is a pleasure to welcome everyone to this evening's very special webinar. The SHSU History Webinar Series has worked to enrich the sense of intellectual community shared by the distance learners in our graduate program. Each month, our historians in training exchange ideas and engage in conversation with some of the most talented and innovative practitioners of our craft working today. And of course, tonight's speaker, Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, a winner of the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, is certainly no exception. Dr. Gordon-Reed, it's a true honor to welcome you to SAM tonight. We're very fortunate to have you for what will be a very important and meaningful conversation, I know, as much about our collective past as about our collective present. I want to turn things back over to Dr. Park for few housekeeping reminders and for the introduction of tonight's distinguished guest. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Jordan. A few notes of reminder, all of you attending as attendees, we strongly encourage you to participate through adding your questions. You can find that feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen at the Q&A button. Hit the Q&A button, type in your question, and I will be asking Professor Gordon-Reed all the questions you have, and we really hope that this will be a discussion with the broader group as much as is possible. By way of introduction, Professor Annette Gordon-Reed is one who doesn't need very much introduction because A, many of you know her work, and B, many of you have experienced her work in our graduate seminars. I realized early on in my teaching career here at SAM that I had to be careful assigning Annette Gordon-Reed's books because half of my students had already read them in other seminars, which just makes me have to be more selective in which books I assign. Annette's first introduction into the historical world was through her book on the Hemmingses. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, an American Controversy, published by University of Virginia Press, which disrupted the long-held assumption that Thomas Jefferson did not have a attachment, I think is the word that Professor Gordon-Reed likes to use, with Sally Hemings, and it really transformed the field. She followed that up a decade later with The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, which basically won every possible award a history book can receive, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the National Book Award. She has received a MacArthur Genius Grant as well as a Guggenheim Fellow. She has been the Harmsworth Professor at Oxford University. She's received the National Endowment or National Award for the Humanities from President Barack Obama. And basically, she's about as close to a rock star as an academic can get, while still remaining about as humble and approachable as an academic can be, which I'm not quite sure how she can balance that. Locally, she's also a hero. She hails here from Conroe, Texas. I'm zooming from my house in Conroe. And if I were to just go down the road 5 minutes, you would find a mural to Professor Gordon-Reed, as well as a bust in the city square. So it was quite fortuitous for us that when she chose her new project a couple of years ago, she decided to write the book that was just published earlier this year on Juneteenth, which talks about race and slavery and the fight for equality for African Americans in Texas history. And it's not only a short read, but it's an engrossing read and deeply poignant read that I truly believe everyone in this area should be able to encounter. And Annette can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you first encountered Thomas Jefferson books in the form of Dumas Malone's biography in the Sam Houston University Library, which so in a way just makes us all the more poignant. And I will say personally, the best compliment I can give Professor Gordon-Reed is that when I was a PhD student on fellowship living in Boston, I found out that she was going to be directing a seminar for the New York Historical Society in New York City, a weekly seminar on race and the law in the early republic. And I took down a megabus. And those of you who have experienced this megabuses know what this means. I took down a megabus from Boston to New York every week just so I could sit at her feet and learn from her brilliance. So without further delay, let me give a warm welcome to Professor Annette Gordon-Reed.
Well, thank you. Thank you both, Brian and Ben, for your introductions. And you're right, I'm very glad to be here tonight. It would be nice to be there, actually, because growing up in Texas, I had music lessons in Huntsville. My music teacher's husband was a music teacher at Sam Houston State University. And sometimes on the weekends, once I got my driver's license, I would come up to Sam to go to the library. After I had pretty much exhausted everything that I wanted to see in the Montgomery County Library in my hometown, I used to go up to Sam Houston State University and just sit in the library. And that is where I first encountered Duma Malone's 6-volume set of biographies of Jefferson, and the Farm Book and other things as well. So this place has a, I have a soft spot for Sam because of that. I never thought that I would write a book like on Juneteenth. My other books are, well, longer, much longer than this. They are straight history books to the extent that I talk about myself at all. I talk about myself maybe in the introduction, a sort of an anecdote to get things going, but I don't typically write about myself. And my editor, who is actually Ben's editor as well, Bob Weil, has been asking me to do a book about Texas for a number of years now, but he's wanted a big book about Texas where I would sort of talk about the history of slavery or just talk about the history of Texas, but to do a large volume about this state where I grew up. And I put that sort of on the back burner. I'm doing another volume of the Hemmings family story that I've been working on that. And then the pandemic came along and interrupted my plans for that I was really going to get going on it this past year. And then this past year happened, 2020 happened, and I wasn't able to go to the archives and doing things that I wanted to do. And I was here in New York City, which, as you probably know, was ground zero in the early part of the pandemic. It was the place where the hospitals were overrun. I would go out to take a walk in Central Park and I could see tents that were put up in the park to get the overflow of people from the hospitals when the hospitals were too full with COVID patients. And so there was not very much to do. We were quarantined here with my husband, and Harvard had gone virtual, and I was doing classes, but we were doing classes, as I said, over the computer. And there was no point in me going down to Cambridge to do that. So I stayed here in Manhattan. And while I was here doing classes, and then when classes were over, I was thinking about my parents. I was thinking about how they would have responded to this particular crisis, something that was unprecedented in our times, something that we'd never experienced and that we were experiencing all over the world. People were in the thrall to this particular virus. And I thought about them and I began to miss them. And at the same time, I had done an article for the New Yorker about Juneteenth, a short article talking about growing up in Texas and what the holiday meant. And Bob, even before he saw this piece, said, why don't you write something about Texas? He raised the subject again. And it all came together because I was thinking about my parents. He raised the question of Texas. I had written this essay about Juneteenth. And some months before then, I had done for the New York Review of Books, a review of 5 books about Texas. So Texas and my family were on my mind when he raised this subject. And I thought it would be a good idea to do something. And we wanted something that would be not so long. And he wanted it relatively quickly. But since I was here once the classes were over, not having to prepare for class, not being able to go anywhere, I decided to write a very personal short book that would talk about my family, but would talk about Texas history through my family history. So I have a somewhat complicated, ambivalent feeling, I should say, about memoir, about the form of memoir. I don't like to focus on myself so much, but I wanted to have enough of myself in the book to set up the stories about Texas, to set up what I thought was important to know about the state. One of the things that's happened to me since I moved up north, now I came as an 18-year-old, I left Texas and came up to New Hampshire to go to school at Dartmouth. And then I stayed at Harvard Law School, and then I moved to New York with my husband. One of the things that I've had to do all of those years is to explain Texas. I think Texas and Florida are probably the two states where the residents who leave those states have to explain, well, why is it this way? What does this mean? Why did that particular strange thing happen? And I wanted to try to talk about Texas history, to explain some things about Texas that I think people misunderstood or did not know. And one of the things that I've keyed in on, and I key in on it in the book, is this idea of what Texas is about, what Texas is like. And it's sort of exemplified in a question that one of my classmates asked me when I was in Dartmouth. She said, well, what's it like to live near the desert? Well, being in Huntsville, that we're not close to the desert. Conroe is not close to the desert. My only understanding, or my only dealings with the desert of West Texas, was maybe a couple of times coming out in the morning, and there would be sort of a fine dust on the car, or on the lawn furniture or whatever, because there'd been a storm and it carried over. But that's not the same as living in the desert. The wind carries things from California to Manhattan, as a matter of fact. It was far away. The desert was far away. So people think of the topography of Texas as like the Old West, with tumbleweeds rolling around and sparsely populated cacti, those kinds of things. And also they think of cowboys. They think of a cowboy, or they think of a rancher. Those figures are the sort of iconic Texas figures. Those people are typically white, even though many of the cowboys, as you probably know, were Black, were people of color and Latino. But the idea is of a sort of Anglo-Saxon guy as the symbol of Texas. And I say in the book, many people construct Texas is a white guy. He has a gender and a race. And that's not the truth of Texas also. So you have cowboys, cattlemen, and oilmen. The person, the people who work in the oil fields or who strike it rich. And this is exemplified in the movie Giant, which I'm sure many of you may have heard of, if not seen, that presents Texas as the sort of history of Texas as once there were cowboys, cattlemen, and then their territory was encroached on by oilmen. And those are that's the origin story of Texas and the conflict between the two of them and how it actually gets resolved. And I say in the book, and I think that this is important, what's left out of that is that there was another sort of figure in Texas, and that is the slave plantation owner. And most people don't think about slavery in relationship to Texas. They think about it, as I said, the West. Slavery belongs to the South. And people don't think of Texas as having anything to do with the South. It's Southwest, and that's true. And West, I don't want to say that the West isn't a part of Texas, but the southern part of Texas escapes many, many people. They don't know that the eastern part of Texas was part of and wanted to be part of the Cotton Empire. That's why one of the reasons they went along with the Confederacy is that the people who moved there had come from Georgia and Alabama and other places, Virginia, some from Virginia, other places as well, with enslaved people, including some of my ancestors, to farm Texas, to be a part of the Cotton Empire. They don't know that Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, following in his father's footsteps, his father Moses got the opportunity to be sort of the sort of impresario, to bring settlers into Texas, into East Texas, for the express purpose of felling the trees, creating farmland, and making it part of the Cotton Empire. Moses died, and Stephen F. Austin took up his mantle. And he explicitly states that, he didn't care for slavery, but not because he cared so much about African-American people or the morality of slavery. It was because he didn't like the idea of so many Black people mixing and living in a society with whites. And so he was ambivalent about it. But at the same time, he explicitly stated that slavery was necessary to do the kinds of things that they wanted to do in Texas, to make it the kind of society that they were hoping to make. And that is a part of the Cotton Empire that was making not the society so much, but some people very, very rich in the rest of the South. And that's what he wanted to do. And he said if people came there without the institution of slavery, they would be poor for a very long time because they would not be able to do the things that were necessary by themselves, quickly by themselves. So the father of Texas is also a person who was a champion of this institution about which he was ambivalent because of the racial component, but he understood that it was something that was required. And so that changes a lot if you think about Texas as part of the South and you don't just fixate on the West and cattlemen and oilmen. It's about the institution of slavery. And slavery, of course, created a racial hierarchy. Racially based slavery created a racial hierarchy. It told white people and Black people, their place, tried to set their place in society. So I wanted to talk about what slavery, the legacy of slavery, has meant in Texas, how it has influenced Texas over the years. So, I began the book, but I also wanted to talk about the history of the peoples of Texas as well. I mean, one of the interesting things about the state is that it didn't have to become diverse. It started out as a diverse place. Obviously, the large numbers and the variety of indigenous people, First Nation people who were in Texas long before it was Texas, Hispanic people, Hispanic population, African Americans, European Americans, white Americans, all in this place from the very, very beginning. It didn't have to become diverse. It began that way. And a lot of the tensions that are in the state and that exist today grow out of that. One of the things that I say is that Texas it sort of embodies so much of American life. There's no other state that I can think of that has all of these features, the conflict with Native Americans, plantation slavery, Jim Crow after the end of slavery, a state that was a republic, its own republic, and a state that borders a foreign country, so that immigration and the border control is an issue in this state. So, I mean, there are other states that have aspects of these things, but Texas has all of them. And it makes for a very, very volatile mixture. And it has influenced the history of the state, the course of history of the state. So I start the book talking about the people here and with the idea of sort of setting all of this up by discussing the presence of the first person of African descent that we know of in Texas. And many of you, if you grew up in Texas and took Texas history, you might have encountered a man named Esteban or Estebanico, as he is called in Cabeza de Vaca's memoirs of their time. Estebanico there were other people of African descent in the area that is Texas, but he's the one that we know. And we know he came there on an expedition with the Spanish. And I talk about the fact that when I was growing up, when we took 4th grade and 7th grade history, Texas history, the fact that it happened in Spanish times and the time of the Spanish was treated as, we kind of, rushed over that to get to the Anglo people because, they won, the Spanish didn't keep Texas. And so it's not seen as important. And when I argue in one chapter is that African-American people should claim the people who came to Texas and the area of Texas and Florida and other places with the Spanish, because that is a part of our origin story as well. You know, it might make sense for Europeans to sort of divide these time periods up, you know, between the Spanish and the English, but enslaved people, whether they were enslaved by people who were English, spoke English, or Spanish or French, had something in common. First place, slavery, but they were also influenced by, they were also affected by a system of white supremacy that helped shape their lives, no matter, you know, where they were, no matter what language they spoke. So I began the story of Blacks in Texas with Estebanco, not with Anglo Blacks, but to say that this is something that it was long before 1619. This is in the 1520s. Estebanco is walking across parts of Texas and Mexico over to the Pacific seaboard with Cabeza de Vaca and the other survivors of this expedition that went wrong. And, you know, in the 1500s. So there's a Black presence there. And there were other Blacks who were there as well. Some of them who stayed in the Texas area. Some of them went down into what is now Mexico and Central America, formed communities there, mixed with the indigenous people there. It's not just plantation slavery. It was important for me, for people to think about the African presence in Texas, in that area, before 1619, and also before plantation slavery took hold, just so people could understand that Black people were in this area doing all kinds of things. Estebanco at times served as a translator between the indigenous people. Cabeza de Vaca indicate that he had a facility with language. And so to have, what difference would it make if that had been emphasized in my education about the sort of variety of things that African people were doing in this area, and that they were there before the English came to Texas in any large numbers. So from there, I set this up talking about the presence of Africans in Texas, in the area of Texas. And then I talk about I decided to become personal, and I talk about my family story that is related to this issue of slavery. Once slavery, you know, came to Texas, and then when it ends, there was a period of Jim Crow, and I had a hand in my hometown of Conroe of being someone who ushered in a new age, because when I was 6 years old, I integrated the schools in Conroe, Texas. And I went to Anderson Elementary School. My parents decided to defy, to defy what the traditional, the expectations were. This is 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Texas and, you know, communities in Texas and all across the South were resisting Brown and trying to come up with some alternative to it. And they came up with something called the Freedom of Choice Plan. And under the Freedom of Choice Plan, white parents were supposed to pick, you know, white schools for their kids, and Black parents were supposed to pick Black schools. My parents did something different, and they decided to send me to Anderson Elementary School. And that's how I integrated our schools back in the mid-60s. And I talk about what a difficult time that was for me. I knew I was doing something important. I knew that I was sort of on display during this time period. And I talk about what happened 3 years later when the Supreme Court declared freedom of choice plans unconstitutional. And then all the schools in Conroe had to be integrated. And what that did to the Black school in my hometown, where my mother taught and where my older brothers went, it was sort of a story. It's a story of good and bad. Things were won and things were lost. And I talk about what was won and what was lost in that particular chapter. I also talk about the other, on this theme of people, the Native American presence in Texas, and the fact that I was born in Livingston, Texas, which is about 50 miles northeast of Conroe. And in Livingston, about 17 miles from where I was born, is an Indian reservation, the Alabama Coshada Indian Reservation. And I grew up as a teenager in the 70s when Native American iconography was very, very in vogue. And I get to talk about that time period, what it was like for people to romanticize Native Americans, even as they sort of suggested that they no longer existed. And the chapter is called The People of the Past and the Present. And I say that because they are present. They were very much present. And I knew they were present because I used to go to the reservation. And despite what was the stories that were told or things that were portrayed in the media, they were alive and there, and very much a presence in this area. So that gives me an opportunity to talk about the history of Native Americans, indigenous people in Texas. And I end this, and then I talk about the Alamo as well. And this is something that the strange thing about having this book come out at this particular moment is, as I'm sure you know, there's a fierce battle going on now about how we talk about the Alamo, how we talk about Texas history and what that means. And so the chapter, Remember the Alamo, I discuss what that meant to me growing up, sort of taking in the legend of Jim Bowie and David Crockett and William Barrett Travis, and then finding out as a teenager that the Republic of Texas, the people who were fighting for the Republic of Texas, were interested in preserving the institution of slavery. Mexico had outlawed slavery, and they were afraid. They'd given the Texans an exemption, but they were never Texians. They were never satisfied. They were never secure, I should say, in, that they would be able to maintain slavery in Texas as they knew it. And there were other things that went on. It wasn't just about slavery. There was a concern about federalism. They'd suspended the Constitution, and there were other problems that they had. But as I told you, I mean, the reason many people came there was to make Texas part of the Cotton Empire, and anything that threatened that, sort of got their guard up and made, was on their radar screen. So what do you do? How do you remember the Alamo when you know that part of what they were fighting for was to maintain the system of slavery? And in fact, the Texas Constitution, the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, actually supports and protects slavery explicitly. And it also says that African-American people can't live there without the permission of the state, of the government, that Blacks could not become citizens of Texas, or the Republic of Texas. So it's a dicey story. It's a complicated story. How do you separate out notions of valor and bravery, which people were taught to revere about the fighters of the Alamo, at the Alamo, with this uncomfortable reality, that for my ancestors, that this was a bid to essentially keep my ancestors in bondage. And I talk a little bit about how I reconcile that or don't reconcile that. And I end with a chapter on Juneteenth, talking about my grandparents. And this is my great-grandparents. And this is the part that was difficult for me. And I went over this with my editor, Bob Weil, about how personal I wanted to be. We had a back and forth about whether or not I was going to use names of my great-grandparents and my family. And I decided I didn't want to do that, because I referred to them as my great-grandparents and my, grandmother and great-grandfather, because I thought that the more personal I became, the more names I used, and sort of setting out a family tree, that the story would really be about me. And I really wanted the story to be about Texas, to use my family to talk about the day. And the connection is that my great-grandfather, who had a farm with my great-grandmother in Moscow, Texas, a cotton farm, used to go down to Galveston, Texas, to work on the wharves because for extra money. He actually could hire people to help my great-grandmother and his daughters, because their son had died. And he came out ahead by working on the wharves, and then, after planting and so forth. And so he was a seasonal worker there. And so Galveston figures obviously in this story, because Galveston is the place where Gordon Granger came in on June 19th, 1865, to say that slavery was over in Texas. And so this city that has been eclipsed by Houston, which used to be, Galveston used to be as the port, the important city in Texas. And so I use that as a jumping off place to talk about, this day that was special to Black Texans who have been celebrating Juneteenth since 1865. The first celebration is 1866. In 1876, a group of men in Houston buy land to celebrate, specifically for the purposes of celebrating Juneteenth, that became Emancipation Park, and which still exists today. I've been to Emancipation Park for Juneteenth celebrations, and they still have them now. And I wonder, I would love to be there next year to see what they're going to do for the first real one. I mean, this one was the first one after it became a national holiday, but this is the next year. I have a feeling it's going to be a big blowout, and I would love to be there for that. So that's the end of the chapter, and end of the book is to talk about Juneteenth and what that day meant to my family, how we celebrated it, and the story of the perseverance of African-American people in the face of some real hostility. I mean, when some of the people who celebrated back in 1865 were whipped for celebrating, and there was violence done to the freedmen even after that, but they nevertheless persisted in celebrating the holiday. And that's why I think it's become a national holiday today. I mean, I know that there are some other people who are really skeptical about that. Some people from, South Carolina and other places that have their own day that they celebrate emancipation. I think South Carolina celebrates on January 1st, linking it to the Emancipation Proclamation. Other days in Virginia. And I remember one person saying to me, somewhat, not in a hostile way, but said, why Texas? Why should we celebrate the end of slavery in Texas and not, in my home state? And the only thing I can say is that it's the perseverance of Black Texans who've been insistent about this for 156 years, who carried this holiday when they moved to California, when they moved to Michigan, when they went other places. They took the holiday with them, and that's how it had come to be celebrated in other states outside of Texas. And the Black Texas diaspora took it with them. And I don't know that Blacks in other states and other places did that, where they went places and saying, well, we used to celebrate this in Florida, and now you have to celebrate it. That's a very Texan kind of thing to do. And I expected when I started writing this book that it might become a holiday, but I wasn't writing the book with this as an idea in mind at all. And I was actually a little surprised that it happened when it happened this year. And it happened so quickly. It was like a Tuesday and the House votes, and then the next day the Senate, or Thursday the Senate votes. And then the next thing I know, I get an email from the White House asking me if I could come down for the signing ceremony. So, this is like at 9:30 in the morning. By 11 o'clock, I'm on a flight and I'm down there. And it was a wonderful occasion to be there in a place where everybody was happy about this. This has been a rough year or so in America. And this was something that everybody was happy. And Miss Lee was there, Opal Lee, who I've been on a couple of programs with over the past few months with the book and all, made it to the White House, and she was there, and President Biden honored her and paid special attention to her. And it was such a wonderful, wonderful occasion. This is not anything that I could have dreamed of when I was sitting in my apartment, beginning to write on Juneteenth, that it would end up this way. But it was a perfect kind of ending for this, not ending, but a perfect beginning for it, because I really do hope that this is a book that has a life. It's the kind of book that I would have loved to have had when I was a teenager. And I wrote it specifically so that a wide range of people could read it and understand it, and sort of take in the lessons that I hope to teach about this, and that they would understand more about Texas. So this has been a great journey for me doing this. And it's the kind of writing, strangely enough, that I thought I would be doing when I was growing up and reading a lot and coming up to Sam to read books and so forth. I thought I would be a writer. a la James Baldwin or someone, writing essays and doing personal things. And then I never thought of becoming a historian at that time period, but this is sort of a return to my roots in a lot of really important ways. And I actually, one of the worst things about this pandemic, many terrible things about the pandemic, but I would have loved to have been able to come down and actually talk to people and meet people. I'm looking forward to maybe doing that next year. I have a feeling that there will be a lot of hoopla again around June 19th next year. And maybe then I could come down and see some of you in person. So with that, I'd like to take your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction. I think I speak for all of us for thanking you for coming back to your essay writing to write on Juneteenth, because it's a book that means a lot to all of us. We're starting to get questions in, and participants, please write your questions in the Q&A so we can present them to Professor Gordon-Reed. I'd like to start just with one short question. You spoke of the timeliness of the book, that you wrote it in a specific context last summer. Mm-hmm. With your family on your mind and Texas on your mind. And then it fortuitously appeared at a point in history this year when Juneteenth suddenly became a national holiday. But the other big historical context this year, of course, are the national debates over critical race theory and all these things. And I'm wondering what you make of this juxtaposition that we get in America right now, that the same year that we're getting these deep-seated angsty debates over critical race theory is also the same year that we finally recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you see these things happening in tandem?
Well, it's amazing. That too is another confluence that I would never have predicted here. I mean, I know that Texas always has a problem about history, about the things that go in textbooks and so forth. But this has been really weird, out of left field. As a law professor, I mean, critical race theory, the phrase apparently, and intersectionality, those things were coined by my classmate, Kim Crenshaw. We were in the same section at Harvard Law School. And she was influenced by Derek Bell, who was a Harvard professor. He came back. He had been at Harvard previously, but been away to be a dean, and he came back the year after I left. But so this is a law school thing, and they don't even teach it in all law schools. It's just inconceivable to me that people, I mean, sure, one person somewhere maybe think they're doing this, but this is not a K through 12 subject matter. What seems to have happened is that any discussion of race at all is considered to be critical race theory. And, all critical race theorists all talk about race, but not all people who talk about race are critical race theorists. And so it is weird to think of a holiday where you recognize the end of slavery, but in Texas, but you're not supposed to be able to talk about stuff around slavery. And, it's very, very bizarre in a slave system that, unlike other slave systems in history, was racially based. That's you can't understand what happened and what happened afterwards you can't have Jim Crow. If the slaves had been white, there'd be no way to have Jim Crow. I mean, you couldn't separate people out. They would have blended in with other folks, and that would have been the end of it. So it is very, very strange. And to think about, what is it, Project 1836, to think about that date and know that that Constitution has the provisions in it that I talk about. How can you teach students about the Republic of Texas and not have them read the Constitution? Do you redact that stuff and say, we can't talk about that? It's very, very weird. I mean, and it just sort of came out of nowhere. We understand that this is to some degree, it was a manufactured thing. But I do think that I take people seriously when they say that they're concerned about teaching race in classes, because I do think that teachers have become much more open in the past few years than when I'm back in the dark ages when I was in school. And so they are responding to something, but they're not responding to critical race theory. They're responding to the greater inclusiveness in history classes and the truthfulness about, about the effects of slavery and race. And that makes people uncomfortable.
Excellent, thank you. We have a question from Dr. Bernadette Pruitt, one of our wonderful faculty members. Says, as an African-American woman who moved to Texas in the mid-1980s for college, I knew very little about Texas history. Nevertheless, I learned Texas history as an undergraduate. Eventually, I learned about Juneteenth. I'll actually add really quick that Dr. Pruitt is also now an expert on Texas history, so she's underselling herself a little bit here now too. The state, like the United States, in many ways ignored the historic event. I earned my undergraduate degree at Texas Southern University and became very knowledgeable about Juneteenth and Black Texas's contributions to Texas history, Southern history, and US history. Your work potentially resituates the history of emancipation. When scholars highlight emancipation, they rarely discuss Texas. Of course, the work of J. Mason Buer, the folklorist, as well as recent studies by Naomi Carrier, is an exception to the rule. Will your work help to make Texas a central component of this important history?
Well, I certainly hope so. Because one of the points that I make in the book and made in talks is that, as I'm sure she knows, emancipation was a process. That if you could start it with, the proclamation, you started with African-American people leaving plantations. There were different, the advancing Union Army, there were different points. And I do think that Texas should be, now that it's a national holiday, I think the great thing about it as a national holiday is that it's a holiday that's built for history. It's just the perfect occasion to talk about emancipation as a process that took place, in Georgia, it was one way, Virginia, it was another way, Texas. I would like to see Juneteenth become sort of like an umbrella to start the conversation, and then talk about this process that unfolded across the country. But people don't focus on Texas because people think of it as the way. The slavery in Texas, they think, oh, it's just, it was a part of the Confederacy. It only existed for a short amount of time, but we know that slavery was there before it became a republic. It was there afterwards, and it had a history of slavery, and that should be talked about.
All right, so building on that of the discussion, let's talk about the issue of celebration, because George Oliver asked the good question. On Juneteenth in Huntsville, I don't know what year he's referring to here, but on Juneteenth in Huntsville, a resentful white resident used the occasion to murder a Black woman celebrant on the courthouse lawn. On this Juneteenth, the day officially went national. What way should we use this new focus to draw out history and enduring historical legacies in this country? How do we accomplish this in the face of conservative backlash against institutions like critical race theory as acceptable metrics for historical assessment? So how do we balance this history and celebrating?
Yeah, well, that's come up quite a bit. Is this a celebration or is it a commemoration or what? I think it has to be both. It's celebratory because you think about, for me, it's thinking about the people in that moment, back in that time period, who realized that by law, they knew they were going to still have all kinds of problems, but by law, they would not have their families sold to people, sold away from them, which was the trauma, the number one trauma that people, more than whipping, more than other kinds of things. It's the law, that phrase, never to see again, never to be seen again, that comes through in so many of the narratives and so many family histories and all those things, that this was a trauma. And so I think about the people who at that moment were hopeful. And I think celebrating Black joy, there is such thing as Black joy, and celebrating that is important. At the same time, as I mentioned, there were people ready to whip people for this, and who did, and as he said, committed acts of violence against people. I think we have to do it. Historians just have to be, and historians, and I don't mean just people in the academy, public history, citizens, whatever, we have to keep the history in focus. I mean, to make sure that we talk about those kinds of things and raise those issues. Many of the Juneteenth celebrations that I've seen in places, there's a component of education in it. There are a number of books for kids of different ages, different for young adults, for little kids about it. We just have to keep talking about it. I mean, eventually this will be a day when there'll be white sales and, mattress sales and car sales. I mean, it'll join like poor, Lincoln and the President's Day. It'll come to that at some point. But the advantage that we have is that we've had 156 years of Texans celebrating this. We know how to do this. And many of them, education is a part of it. Telling the story, as I said before, even just the recitation of what happened, the characters, Gordon Granger, first thing we got to do is get it right. The notion that African-American people didn't know that there was an Emancipation Proclamation is not right. It's not about people learning 2 years late. The Confederates kept fighting. They went, Granger comes after the surrender of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, and he can take over the District of Texas at that point. So they knew. It's just that what can you do about it if the fighting is still going on? So I think by writing about it, talking about it, op-eds, articles, people who have any kind of access to media should be talking not just about the celebration, but talking about this other aspect of it, because it was there was a moment of hopefulness that got crushed. And Texas right now is, are we back in a Redeemer government here? What's going on here? It's like everything old is new again. And we have to make those kinds of connections. And it really does come, as I've said over and over again, from this notion of racial hierarchy that was created in slavery that is still affecting Texas. There are people who've not given up this idea that Black people belong in a lesser and subordinate position, and are doing everything to make that, to keep that in place.
And it reminds me of Eric Foner once saying, and I share this quote in my class a lot, that we're still trying to answer the questions of Reconstruction, right? We're still living in that world. You've probably already answered this, but maybe this will give you a platform to elaborate a bit more. But can you see Juneteenth ever becoming as much of a broad celebration like the 4th of July, or is it merely a symbolic victory that will be celebrated by those who have always been celebrated?
I think more people will celebrate it. I think it's because of the nature of the holiday. For one thing, and this is what commends it over January 1st and the other dates that people mention, just the practical thing, it's in the summer. And it's a barbecue. It's a family day. And I think that it should be not only selling it as a day of education, or making it a day of education, it should be trumpeted that this is a day for family. And I think it's evolved that way. It is sort of a legacy of slavery, in the sense of this idea of bringing people together, of getting together, gathering the family together. And that's not a racial thing. I think if it will be associated with a day of bringing family together, and I suggested on other occasions, it should be a day, I would hope, because of my own negligence in not talking to my great-grandmother about her life, now sort of regretting that I would hope it would be a day where people develop the habit of taking family histories, talking to older people in your family, not just get together and have barbecue and red soda water, but talk to your grandmother, your great-grandmother, listen to what they had to say, gather a family history, oral history, write it down. I think that if we make it about that, and also keeping the educational function, making that a part of it, I do think it will be more widespread. It's not going to be July 4th. I can't see it in, certainly not in my lifetime but I think it can be meaningful. It could be meaningful because we have the template from what people have been doing for the past 156 years. It is about family. And so that could be white people, Black people, Asian people, whomever, who can celebrate. And then, that could be, we need more days like that for families to get together.
Excellent. Thank you. Shifting gears a little bit, a question from Dr. Nancy Baker, another one of our professors. Can you tell us about your process and or routine for writing, especially when starting a new book? And I'll add on top of that, maybe if you could talk about both writing something like On Juneteenth, as well as writing, one of the bigger books you've written, because you've now mastered both of those crafts.
Mm-hmm. Well, writing on Juneteenth was different because I was in my apartment. I don't typically like to write at home. I like to go out to work. And when I was at NYLS, New York Law School, I would go into my office. That's where I mainly wrote the Hemingses and Monticello and Vernon Can Read. I went to the Harvard Club to write. Now that I don't have an office here in New York, I tend to go to the Harvard Club to write. I think it's better for me. Or sometimes I go to Starbucks and write. And I always buy stuff, buy more than one coffee if I'm there for a while. I need to go out to work, but here I couldn't do that. I had to work at home. Not to say I never worked at home, but that was more cleaning up stuff or that's not the hardcore writing. But this one I had to stay inside and write. So I just set aside a time and wrote. I mean, there was something. I'll say it. There's a series called The Untouchables with Elliot Ness, and there's a channel that has Untouchable Sunday, and they show back-to-back episodes of Untouchables, and I got a lot of writing done there watching that, and so this was like a completely different process. Sometimes I'll have to be by myself writing. Other times, I could be watching TV, listening to music, and doing other stuff and writing. But this was written in my, sitting on the couch, essentially, in my living room, watching various, TV shows. Strangely enough, a lot of Westerns as well. So I have a process that's when I'm doing it normally, my normal process is to go to my office and write, because when I write, I'm sort of dictating to myself in a way. So it's better if I'm in a room by myself talking to myself when I'm, in some other venue. My first book, a good part of it was dictated. I talking into a tape recorder and then transcribing it and then beginning to write. It's very hard for me to start writing on a computer, just in general. I either have to dictate it or I have to write it out longhand until I get going. And then once I get going, I can put it on the computer and then go from there. But just whatever it takes.
What about the research angle? I know you didn't have to do the same type of research for
Yeah.
the book, but a lot of the students who are listening to this have probably read Hemingses and Monticello, and they've seen you be able to reconstruct this world of these often forgotten figures who don't leave, lots of artifacts or written, of course, there are some reminiscences you have from them.
Yeah.
How do you go about writing about these people, these families that often get overlooked by historians by, want of, the archival record?
Well, I mean, with the Hemingses, I had an advantage in that I had a whole family. I couldn't do a biography of Sally Hemings. There's not enough there. I couldn't do a biography of Elizabeth Hemings. There's not enough there. But if you take the whole family, there's a lot. And so you just have to, you sort of have to figure out, you follow the people where they are. Robert and Dolly Hemings are in Richmond. So there's a section so I have to find out about Richmond. What was Richmond like in the 1790s? What is everything I know about Robert there with his wife Dolly and their children? you know, what are Martin and Elizabeth. So I write around them. You know, I try to recreate the world that they lived in. Where did Blacks live? You know, how many were there? What was the place like? And fit them, sort of put them into that too. And so you're researching around these people and putting them in that circumstance. Like when I'm writing about Conroe, when I'm writing about my integrating the school, I have to tell the people what Conroe was like. And I talk about the history of Conroe, that this was a place where a man was burned at the stake on Courthouse Square in the late 1920s, where a man was shot in an open courtroom. A Black man was shot in an open courtroom by the husband of the woman that he supposedly raped. And that my grandfather told me this story when I was growing up. I didn't even know it was a Supreme Court case. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court because the guy had been tortured into confessing. And so what I'm doing is I'm building a picture of what Conroe is like. And then I say, now, here we are, fast forward to me. That was just, you know, from 1940 to 1965. It's not a very long time in terms of history. And this place, this is what the racial situation was like. So it's really about researching around the person and finding out as much. You need to know what the place is like to be able to let the reader be able to imagine what the person is going through. And, you know, as I said, I could do that enough to have a book because I had a lot of people to write about. But if you're thinking about the individual thing, is think about your life. What are the things in your world that shape your existence? You know, I live in a place where there are lots of people, coffee shops, all, you know, and there's sort of a rhythm of my neighborhood, rhythm of Manhattan. And if you wanted to talk about me in this world, you would have to figure those things out. And that's the fun of it. You know, what is 18th century France like? How did servants, what were some of the things that servants did? Some of the perks they had, some of the problems they had, how were they paid? You know, looking at Jefferson's records and finding out when he's paying the Hemingses their salary every month, which they didn't do in France. They paid you once a year. So then, you know, so he's on the sort of Anglo model of payment, and he's in another place where the servants would have been getting paid once, and then sometimes they didn't pay them and they have to hold over for another year. So what does it mean if you have money in hand? If you are James and Sally Hemings and you're getting paid every month, so you're not waiting for stuff. And, you know, finding out that he's overpaying all of his servants. So it's fun in a way to try to think of, you know, what it's like being a designer in a way. You're thinking of what kind of details can I pull out of the story around these people to create a picture of the place where they're living.
Interesting. I forget if this was the metaphor you use in the book or if it was just a metaphor that came to mind, but I like the idea of, you know, you're creating a photo negative that you can't, you're getting everything around so that the figure can kind of finally come into focus, which every student that I've talked to have really enjoyed that. All right. Really quick, someone asked who your music teacher was in Huntsville. I'm wondering if they're trying to find a connection here.
Charlotte Tull.
Charlotte Tull, thank you. Gregory Carter asks, should African Americans focus primarily on Pan-Africanism as it relates to history and lineage, or should the focus be more on Black Americans such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, MLK, etc.?
This is the cop-out answer. They should do both. Both should be done. But I think that some people, you have to follow your natural inclination. You know, I think both of those things are important to know. But if you have an interest, you should go with your interest, and you should write the books that you want to write and do the research that you want to do, because that's the only way to do it with sufficient passion and interest to make it good. We need both of those things, but you have to think about, well, where are my interests? When am I willing to, sort of go the extra mile to pull things out? what subject matter excites you that way. So both of them are necessary, but I think the individual has to go with their passion.
Excellent. From John Grusser, isn't a key aspect of Juneteenth the time lag, emancipation delayed and deferred? And thus, shouldn't the holiday be an opportunity for Texas and the US to acknowledge and begin to finally and truly grapple with the fact that for well over a century, freedom for Black people has been delayed and deferred?
Mm-hmm. That's an important point, and that's part of the struggle I think that's going on now in the schools about teaching race, is people who don't want to acknowledge that anything bad happened to African Americans that explains some of the circumstances that we're in now. There's such an investment, a heavy investment in the idea that everything has been fair. And if you talk about these things, children will look at this and say, wait a minute, what do you mean? They couldn't go to school, or they couldn't hold office, they couldn't vote, all those kinds of things. So I think that denial of that is a big part of what is going on right now, and we'll have to see who's going to win with that.
From Andrea Mang, being a Texas native, I have experienced racism. You mentioned briefly in your book about experiencing racism at a young age. How has your experience with racism affected your personal and professional life?
Well, I think my experience with racism early on made me interested in the subject, because when you're 6 years old and you're trying to figure out why going to school with white kids, why is that a big deal? Why is that a problem? Why is it that if we go to the movies, do we have to sit in the balcony? Why do we have a separate waiting room, separate, smaller, inferior waiting room at the local clinic? When I went to the doctor, it made me think about this subject earlier than I would have if none of these things had happened. So I think it's affected me in that, because it has made me aware of race in ways that I would not have been, without these kinds of events. And to think about the larger pattern, that it isn't just something that happened to me, it's something that happened to lots of people. And it really does explain a lot of the problems that we have today. And we're still, as Eric said, and you said, we're still answering questions that were asked in Reconstruction. And from the beginning, can Black people be full citizens in this country? I mean, that was a problem in Reconstruction, and we're still grappling with that.
One last question I have. A lot of our students in our program are secondary educators. They teach at high school and they're getting their degrees so that they can teach dual credit AP classes. So I'm wondering if we could give some practical advice before you sign off. When they teach Texas history, which I'm sure a lot of them have to do, who are the names, what are the events, and what are the themes that you wish more high school teachers were bringing up when talking about Texas?
Well, I mean, the thing that I've been discussing here, the issue of slavery and race, I think, using primary documents from Texas, if you think about Texas history, the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, the Declaration of Independence that doesn't have all men are created equal in there. I would like for people to look at more primary documents to see what things that were on people's minds during that time period. People very often act as if we just started talking about race, that this is a subject that's been made up. But people in the 18th and 19th century talked about race a lot. And if you bring those documents to the fore and make it plain that this is not some newfangled thing that people are just doing to be divisive, I think that's absolutely key. So I would want more of primary documents, more going back to the past to see how people talked about these kinds of things, and let young people make a judgment about them, and things that they make them aware of them, and let them come to their own conclusions. And many of them, I think, probably, and this is why it's controversial, will empathize with the underdog in those situations. But you have to give them the information, and preferably things that were from the time period that you're discussing.
Excellent. We have one final comment that I'm going to use as a sign off here, because I think Portia Hopkins is speaking for all of us when she says, "I'm just here to say I love your work and all you have done for the discipline. Thank you." So with that, I hope all of us, everyone here, can virtually join me in thanking Professor Annette Gordon-Reid for your wonderful remarks and your mentorship and your example in the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's glad to be back in Huntsville.
All right. Thanks again, Professor.
Thanks a lot. Good night.